Hello and welcome to Pitboards and Podiums with me, Maya Westwick. In today's episode, we are going to be talking all about the 2024 Japanese Grand Prix, so buckle up and let's talk F1. Alright guys, so in today's episode I am going to be recapping the Japanese Grand Prix. So, as I did last week for Australia, I'll give you a little bit of info from the practice sessions and then I'll just crack straight on with qualifying and the race. So, FP1, there was another problem for Williams. There was a red flag in FP1 because Logan Sargeant unfortunately crashed. Logan Sargeant this weekend was using the same chassis that Alex Albon had used for his crash in Australia. So Albon still has Logan Sargeant's original chassis and Logan Sargeant is using the repaired chassis for his car. He ended up crashing during practice one. He went in nose first, which kind of saved the chassis a little bit. But of course, there is still no spare chassis at Williams, and it was quite a heavy, high-speed impact after he'd kind of like run onto the grass and then had no grip. So obviously, that is a problem for Williams because in the last 2 or 3 races, they've incurred about £2 million worth of damage. So especially for a team that doesn't really have like this big financial backing, that is massively damaging for them. FP1 was topped by Max Verstappen, and for those of you who are interested as well, as I mentioned in the track guide, Ayumu Iwasa was driving alongside Yuki Tsunoda for RB, just for FP1, and he came 16th in FP1. FP2 was topped by Oscar Piastri, but it was not very representative of a session. It was rained off, so the majority of the hour we didn't really see any cars on track, but Oscar Piastri did manage to achieve the fastest lap of anybody during the little running that they did do. In FP3 we had Daniel Ricciardo spinning out onto the grass after he lost the rear midway through turn 2. He didn't have a dramatic crash or anything like that, but he did spin out. And also Leclerc was frustrated by Ferrari's run plan because it meant that he only got one practice qualifying lap. And obviously with the limited amount of running that they'd had this weekend because of losing so much of practice 2, it meant he literally had one lap to practice doing what he wants to do in qualifying. FP3 was also topped by Max Verstappen. Now on to qualifying. So Q1 was topped by Max Verstappen with a time of 1 minute 28.866 seconds. There was an unsafe release for George Russell that was looked at after the session, where he appeared to be released kind of into the path of Oscar Piastri after his mechanic just basically didn't check to see that the pit lane was empty. That was looked at after the session, and Mercedes received a €5,000 fine for that because obviously cars need to be being released into the pit lane safely. What Mercedes had said was that their plan was that he wasn't going to go out into the fast lane of the pit lane, he was going to go on the slow lane and then filter in further down, but then he swerved into the fast lane to avoid hitting one of Lewis's mechanics, which then put him into Oscar Piastri's path, and Oscar had to swerve, and so Mercedes were fined for that. Leclerc seemed to kind of struggle in Q1. He was very much off the pace and at risk of being out in Q1 until his final lap attempt. Just throughout qualifying, obviously Japan is going to be a bit of an emotional weekend for him, with Jules Bianchi being his godfather, and of course Jules Bianchi unfortunately did 10 years ago have an accident in Japan that ended his life. So yeah, it's going to be an emotional weekend, but he is also a professional athlete and he can compartmentalise and he can still do his job. There was just so much talk from the commentators and the media in general, just talking about his emotional state, saying that he must be depressed and all of this. Like, he just didn't have a good qualifying. It happens. Sauber had a bit of a contrasting Q1 session. Bottas was through to Q2. He was up in P8 at the end of the session, and Zhou was down in P20, qualifying last for the start of the race. 0.5 seconds behind Bottas. And just to kind of show you where Alpine are at the moment, Esteban Ocon actively celebrated getting through to Q2 on his team radio as if he'd just been told he was on pole. They were so happy that they weren't out in Q1, because obviously every other race so far this year they have not left Q1, and Pierre Gasly did not leave Q1. So the 5 drivers that were out in Q1 were Lance Stroll. He was 0.061 seconds off of the cutoff. Then Pierre Gasly, 0.156 seconds. He had quite a lot of problems with traction and getting back on the power that just meant he was not able to extract anything from the car really. Then we had Kevin Magnussen qualifying in 18th, 0.168 seconds off the cutoff. Logan Sargent, P19, 0.176 seconds off, and Zhou Guanyu, P20, 0.18 seconds off. He was just sliding all over the place. His car did not look like it was controllable really, and that is the 3rd consecutive race with Zhou being the bottom qualifier. So obviously, next race in China at home, he is going to be hoping for a much better performance. Q2 was also topped by Max Verstappen with a time of 1 minute 28.74. Hulkenberg had a lap time deletion, so that meant he literally had one chance at a lap right at the end of the session. Things were also again looking a bit hairy for Leclerc. He was down in P9 and not doing another lap, but he did manage to just scrape through to Q3. Like, enough people didn't improve on their laps to push him out of Q2. Tsunoda scrapes through to Q3, knocking teammate Daniel Ricciardo out of qualifying. And the 5 drivers that were out in Q2 were Daniel Ricciardo in P11, 0.55 seconds off of Tsunoda's time. Nico Hulkenberg in P12, 0.77 seconds off. Bottas P13, 0.176 seconds off. Albon P14, 0.297 seconds off. And Ocon P15, 0.399 seconds off. Q3 was once again topped by Max Verstappen with a pole time of 1 minute 28.197 seconds. Mercedes managed to bring 2 fresh sets of soft tyres into Q3, which is the first time this year that they've not had to use one of those sets earlier on in qualifying just to get through to Q3. So of course that means that they have statistically a better chance of getting a faster lap in Q3 than they have been having so far this year. Leclerc and Tsunoda both only had 1 set of fresh soft tyres left, so that kind of put the pressure on them a little bit. And Alonso went into Q3 with 3 new sets of softs. Like, this man just is doing his own thing, he really is. Alonso was, however, a little bit disappointed after his first attempt at a lap. He was in P7 and there was a 10.5 gap to P4, and he said in his team radio, he was like, I don't really know what to do, I thought that was a good lap. Hamilton, after his first attempt, was in P6, half a second behind Verstappen in P1, and again Hamilton was very surprised. He was like, half a second, what am I meant to do? Where am I meant to get that from? And Charles Leclerc also on his team radio said that he didn't know what more he could do. So the qualifying order for the top 10 was Max Verstappen on pole, that is the 4th pole in 4 races this year. Perez P2, 0.066 seconds behind. Norris P3, 0.292 seconds behind. Sainz P4, 0.485 seconds behind. Alonso P5, 0.489 seconds behind. Piastri P6, 0.563 seconds behind. Hamilton P7, 0.569 seconds behind. Leclerc P8, 0.589 seconds behind. Russell P9, 0.811 seconds behind. And Tsunoda in P10, 1.216 seconds behind. That was the 27th front row lockout in Red Bull's history, but only their 3rd in the last 6 years. And in terms of the history of the Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka, it is the 16th front row lockout in 34 qualifying sessions. Also, nice little note, row 4, P7 and 8, next year's Ferrari lineup. So they're suffering together at this point. On to the race. So pre-race, just a bit of information. Alonso, Hulkenberg, Bottas, Ocon, Stroll, Gasly and Sargent were all on soft tyres. Everybody else was on mediums. Alonso is the only driver in the top 11 on softs. Everyone else, as I've said, is on mediums. So within the top 11, he's basically offsetting his own strategy against everyone else in an attempt to get ahead of other people earlier on, and then undercut them, pit earlier, and maintain that track position. So on lap 1, Verstappen was clear into the lead, and there was some contact between Albon and Ricciardo at turns 2 and 3 that brought out the red flag. So we literally got about 3 corners of action, and then there was a red flag. So before they'd even committed to turning the car for the corner, they were both in the wall. Of course, for Williams, that is a massive, massive problem. As I've already said, Alex Albon was using Logan Sargent's old chassis. Logan Sargent had the damaged and repaired chassis. Now Alex Albon's chassis is also damaged. They obviously still only have the 2. Basically, Albon saw a gap around the outside of Ricciardo and, of course, put himself into that gap. Ricciardo then closed the door on him unsighted, didn't see that he was there because Ricciardo had a very poor start, and his right rear tyre made contact with Albon's front left, span him out and sent Albon into the barriers as well, which of course is also not good for Ricciardo, considering he's been given this ultimatum of needing to perform to stay in his seat. So really he needed to have a good weekend, and his race finished on lap 1. So that was not good for either of them. Nobody got any penalties or anything. The stewards did decide it was just a first lap racing incident, so there was no further action necessary, but it's not good for them or for their teams. Once the race got started again, the race restart order, because basically before the red flag was brought out, they'd got past the end of sector 1, which meant that they could use that order when everyone had completed sector 1 as the race restart order, rather than going back to qualifying order. So the order on the restart was Verstappen, Perez, Norris, Sainz, Alonso, Piastri, Hamilton, Leclerc, Russell, Hülkenberg, Bottas, Tsunoda, Ocon, Gasly, Stroll, Magnussen, Sargent and Zhou. And the red flag lasted about half an hour. So the restart tyres, of course, during a red flag you can change your tyres. So technically, if you were to go onto a different compound of tyres and able to make them last the entire race, you wouldn't have to pit again. Of course, everyone's going to have to pit again though. Nobody's going to make the tyres last that long around Japan. But Sainz went on to a new set of mediums, Hamilton onto a new set of hards, Leclerc onto a new set of mediums, Russell onto a new set of hards. So you can kind of see the difference there in the Ferrari and Mercedes strategy. Ocon and Gasly were both on new hards, Stroll on new softs, Magnussen on new mediums, Sargent on new hards and Zhou on new softs. Everybody else, I believe, was on the same tyres as the initial start. Once the restart had obviously happened, we were on lap 3, because lap 2 was basically the lap to the grid again. There's only so much fuel in the cars. So lap 3 was a very clean lap. Everybody made it through. Both the Mercedes drivers lost a place. Hamilton lost P7 to Leclerc and was down in P8. Russell lost P9 to Tsunoda, was down in P10. Both of them having these hard tyres on that needed longer to come in compared to Leclerc's mediums and Tsunoda's soft tyres. Also on the restart though, it was a clean lap, but the Alpines did actually make a little bit of contact on the main straight. So on lap 4, on his team radio, Ocon asked the team to basically just check that his car was okay, because they had made a tiny bit of contact. On lap 5, DRS was enabled and Russell got past Tsunoda for P9. Bottas passed Ocon and Ocon was told that his car looks okay. On lap 6, Stroll passes Ocon, Perez went very wide and opened up a chance for Norris to get past him, and Hülkenberg pits onto the hard tyres coming out in P18. On lap 7, Bottas pits, has a 4-second stop coming out in P17 on the hard tyres. On lap 8, Tsunoda pits and Zhou pits coming out in P16 and 18 respectively, both on the hard tyres. On lap 10, Russell reports that the steering is starting to feel a bit strange. There's a lot of vibrations throughout steering. And on lap 11, Hamilton is told that the medium runners, bearing in mind Mercedes went straight to the hards, the medium runners are seeing high levels of degradation. Around Hamilton at the time, of course, you've got the McLarens, and the McLarens are both on the medium tyres. So that's kind of hinting at him that they are not going to have the tyre life that they wanted. Also on lap 11, Sargent passes Gasly for P13. On lap 12, Norris pits onto the hard tyres, comes out in P10 after a 2.3 second stop. So the medium tyres that he was on did not last very long at all. Also on lap 12, Zhou pits, making his second stop of the race onto the hard tyres. On lap 13, Piastri pits, coming out in P12 on hard tyres, Stroll on the medium tyres in P17, and Zhou pits again to retire the car with a gearbox problem. and then Piastri passes Sargent for P11. On lap 14, Alonso pits coming out in P8 on the mediums, which basically stopped Piastri being able to undercut him. Piastri passed Ocon for P10 and then Magnussen into the hairpin for P9. On lap 15, Sargent absolutely flies past Ocon for P11 and Stroll passes Hülkenberg for P15. On lap 16, Perez pits coming out in P6 behind Lando Norris on the medium tyres, and Sainz also pits coming out in P7 again. Both of them are behind Lando Norris on the medium tyres, so Norris has been able to undercut them both. Also on lap 16, Bottas passes Ocon for P12. On lap 17, Verstappen pits for the first time, has a 2.1 second stop coming out in P3 on the medium tyres, but before the lap is over he passes George Russell to get back up to P2. Norris passes Hamilton around the outside of turn 1 for P4, and Gasly pits coming out in P17 on the mediums. Of course, at this point P17 is last place. Also, Perez passes Hamilton into 130R for P5, so Hamilton's lost 2 places on that one lap. On lap 18, Norris passes Russell for P3 and his hard tyres seem to be absolutely flying. Perez also passes Russell ahead of 130R, so a bit earlier than he'd passed Hamilton previously for P4. On lap 19, Hamilton says on his radio that his front right tyre is dead. Of course, he's still yet to pit. Everyone around him has been pitting, and he's now being passed by drivers who have pitted, which is of course problematic for their strategy. And then Sainz passes him as well for P6. On lap 20, Ocon pits. He has a 2.3 second stop onto the hard tyres coming out in P16 with only his teammate Gasly behind him. On lap 21, Verstappen passes Leclerc into turn 1 for P1. Leclerc is basically told not to lose time fighting Verstappen and Norris because he's on a completely different strategy to them. And also, speaking of strategy, we hear Lewis Hamilton on his team radio very, very clearly annoyed at Mercedes, and he tells them that they need to change this strategy because it is not working. Also on lap 21, Sainz passes Russell for P5, and then on lap 22, Alonso passes Hamilton for P7, Perez passes Norris for P3, and Ocon is told that we need to push now. After he's just set his fastest lap of the race, he's on his team radio. He's like, what do you mean I am pushing? On lap 23, we get quite a few drivers pitting. Russell pits coming out in P9 on the hard tyres, and then we had a little chain of drivers pit. The order they went into the pits was Magnussen, Bottas, Sargent, Tsunoda, Stroll. The order they came out of the pits was not, though. So Tsunoda actually ended up coming out in P11 ahead of everybody else. It was an excellent job from the pit crew. We had Stroll coming out in P13, Magnussen P14, Bottas P15, Sargent P16. On lap 24, Stroll then passes Ocon. On lap 25, Hamilton pits onto another set of hard tyres coming out in P9. And also there was a pit lane infringement noted involving Lance Stroll. As I said, when everyone pitted, it was a little bit chaotic, to be fair, so Stroll was noted for a pit lane incident. On lap 26, Leclerc went very, very wide, which allowed him to be passed by Perez and made him quite vulnerable to Lando Norris. And Norris was told, Lando, we are boxing this lap, which Lando was not happy about. He questioned why they were doing it so early when he was chasing Leclerc down, and McLaren's response was because of the threat from Russell. On lap 27, Leclerc and Norris both pit onto hard tyres. Leclerc has a 2.4 second stop coming out in P6, and Norris has a 2.6 second stop coming out in P8 with Russell between himself and Leclerc. On lap 28, Norris then passes Russell around the outside of turn 1 for P7 in an absolutely gorgeous move, and on lap 31, Leclerc asks who doesn't need to stop in front. He's trying to work out where he can get up to in the order with pit stops, and he is told everybody in front needs to stop again. Also, by this point, Piastri is just finishing his own lap 30, and he has quite a big lockup at the final chicane of the lap, so of course that causes a bit of a problem for him in terms of losing time, and obviously it's showing his tyres are pretty much dead. So on lap 33, Piastri pits onto a new set of hards. He comes out in P9. Russell complains on his team radio of there being a lot of turbulence, says that feels like his helmet is just flying off his head. Stroll got no further action for the pit lane infringement that was being investigated, and Gasly pits coming out in P17 on the hard tyres. On lap 34, Perez pits onto hards coming out in P5, Alonso pits onto hards coming out in P8. Bottas reports Magnussen for weaving on the straight on his team radio. Hülkenberg pits coming out on the hards in P15, and Ocon pits coming out on the medium tyres in P16. On lap 35, Verstappen pits. He comes out on the hard tyres in P2. Perez passes Norris with DRS for P4. Stroll pits onto the soft tyres, coming out in P13, and Sargent onto the mediums in P15. On lap 36, Perez passes Leclerc with DRS on the main straight to get up to P3 for the podium places, and Tsunoda is now running in P10 at home, so he is in the points at his home race. On lap 37, Sainz pits, coming out in P7 on the hard tyres behind Sir Lewis Hamilton. On lap 38, he then passes Sir Lewis Hamilton for P5. Also, Russell pits, coming out on the medium tyres in P9, and Norris scrapes his floor, going a bit wide around one of the corners. On lap 40, Hamilton pits, has a 3.3 second stop onto the mediums, coming out in P9 behind Russell because his front right tyre was slow to come off. On lap 42, Sargent goes into the gravel at Degner 2, which of course brings out the yellow flags in sector 2, but he is able to reverse back onto the track to keep going. Of course, he is now down in last position though in P17. He then pits to replace his tyres and goes onto a set of mediums. On lap 43, Norris locks up. He's clearly struggling for grip on his tyres and he can't get close enough to pass Leclerc, and Sainz is right on his tail, so he is under pressure. On lap 44, Sainz then passes Norris for P4. On lap 45, Ferrari tell Leclerc to not lose time with Sainz, we are racing Norris. So they're basically saying to him, don't fight him, let him pass. On lap 46, Stroll passes Bottas for P12 and Sainz passes Leclerc for P3. On lap 47, Hülkenberg passes Bottas for P13 and Stroll passes Magnussen for P11. On lap 48, Stroll complains, it's unbelievable how bad the speed is on the straights, it's like a different category. And Hülkenberg passes Magnussen for P12. On lap 50, Russell attempts to pass Piastri, but they end up making contact and he forces Piastri off track into the final corner. Piastri is basically saved by having DRS on Fernando Alonso ahead of them, and stays ahead for the time being. This is noted by race control and will be investigated after the race. However, they decided that no further action was necessary despite them making contact, and the stewards noted that when they had obviously had their discussions with both teams, that neither team thought that it should warrant a penalty, so they didn't give it a penalty. On lap 52, Alonso once again is showing that he has an incredible racing IQ. He's driving very cleverly by allowing Piastri into his DRS range for the detection points around the circuit to protect himself from George Russell, because if Piastri is between them getting in George's way, that is one more thing holding him up that's going to stop him being able to get past Alonso. And also, Hülkenberg passes Stroll for P11, and then on lap 53, Russell manages to pass Piastri for P7 on the main straight after Piastri had gone wide through turn 16, but Russell was not able to catch up to Alonso and pass him before the end of the race. So the finishing order of the race was Verstappen in P1 with a race time of 1 hour, 53 minutes and 23.566 seconds. He also set the fastest lap on lap 50, which was a 1 minute 33.706 second lap. This is his third consecutive win at Suzuka, which is something that only Michael Schumacher has managed before. We then had Perez in P2, 12.5 seconds behind, Sainz P3, 20.8 seconds behind, Leclerc P4, 26.5 seconds behind. He made the one-stop strategy work from Ferrari. Nobody else really was able to do that. And he also won Driver of the Day with 23% of the vote. Then Norris P5, Alonso P6, Russell P7, Piastri P8, Hamilton P9, Tsunoda P10. Tsunoda was the first of the drivers to have been lapped, but he was in the points, scoring his first ever points at home. Then there was Hülkenberg, Stroll, Magnussen, Bottas, Ocon, Gasly and Sargent as the rest of the finishers. All of them are lapped down. And then of course we've got Zhou, who DNF'd on lap 13, and Ricciardo and Albon, who both DNF'd on lap 1. This was the first time in Formula 1 history that we've had 4 consecutive 1-2 finishes to start a season. Obviously we've had 3 Red Bulls and 1 Ferrari 1-2. It's the first time it's ever happened. And of course, as I said, for Russell forcing Piastri off track, that was no further action, and for the incident on lap 1 with Ricciardo and Albon, that also was no further action. So there wasn't any post-race penalties or anything that were going to affect their finishing order. So that is everything from the Japanese Grand Prix. I hope that you've enjoyed the podcast. If you have, please do let me know. Like, rate, comment, subscribe, share the podcast. I would really, really appreciate it. Come and join me over on the Pitboards and Podiums TikTok as well, and we can have a lovely little discussion over there. And I will see you very, very soon with a track guide ahead of the Chinese Grand Prix. And then, of course, there will also be the race weekend recap after the Chinese Grand Prix as well. Thank you again, and I'll see you soon. Bye!